Good evening, everybody. It's terrific to see so many of you here at Notre Dame. It's not a very nice night, and I gather you all had a big day of lectures and work, but it is a huge pleasure for me to be able to talk to you for a reason that I think will become a little clearer as we go along explaining about the National Inquiry. I've never given a lecture with a skeleton, being a lawyer, but I guess you're used to it, but I'm a little unnerving, but I will work on it. I am going to talk tonight about the National Inquiry that we called at the Australian Human Rights Commission into the detention of children in immigration. But I'd like to begin by just looking at this rather vainglorious front page of the Daily Telegraph. And here you can see Russell Crowe being taken over by Scott Morrison as captain and commander. And we can see the proclamation. We have the war on boats being won. We've got victory at sea. 12 boats turned around, 45 stopped from leaving port, and 1,673 asylum seekers sent back to where they came from. So the triumphalist style and approach of that front page of the Telegraph struck me most particularly because just about every word in that front page is contrary to the letter and spirit of international law. And that is really where I'm coming from as President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, as I will explain a little as we go along. But perhaps one of the questions I would like to ask, and for all of us to ask, is how did it come to this? I've been a quite quiet academic and commercial lawyer since I was admitted as a barrister and solicitor 47 years ago. No one's really taken very much notice of me. But now there have been scores of cartoons, and this one just about says it all. I didn't think it was too bad of me, actually. I didn't mind too much. What about the children? And then we have our Prime Minister. But what about the politics? Because as you all know, the government dismissed the report as partisan in light of the timing of the inquiry 4 months after the coalition was elected. Now, in fact, as I hope I can explain to you, the inquiry had a retrospective focus spanning the terms of both former and current governments, and indeed was at least equally critical of both major governments. Well, just to give you a little bit of a sense of the environment, this is Christmas Island. In the normal course of events, you would say that it was a beautiful paradise, a tropical paradise in the Indian Ocean. It is an extraordinary environmental paradise with birds swooping down, with deep sea diving and various fish that are quite extraordinary. We have the phenomenon of crabs, 36 million of them descending from the hills into the ocean for spawning, or whatever the appropriate term is for crabs, every year. And beautiful trees and a lovely but hot, sticky, wet tropical climate. But inside the island are 4 phosphate mining camps and centres, and these sorts of buildings in the respective camps for detention centres. There are wires, 14-foot wire fences around these camps, and the people in them are unable to leave except for very exceptional circumstances. This is the sort of treatment that children in detention centres around Australia and in Nauru are receiving. These are hand and head locks that were caught on CCTV cameras, and using my powers as President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, I was able to compel the department to provide us with that CCTV footage. How did it come to this? With a strong UN condemnation of the treatment of asylum seeker children in particular. And we have Mendes, a very well-respected global figure, the Special Rapporteur on Torture, saying a few weeks ago that Australia's policy of mandatory and indefinite detention violates the Convention Against Torture as cruel and inhuman treatment or punishment. Never in the history of Australia's good citizenship in the international environment have we ever been accused of anything of that nature. But as you'll all know, the Prime Minister responded immediately, saying that he was sick of being lectured to by the United Nations, and Mendes said, "We in the UN also deserve respect. I wish the Prime Minister had taken our views more seriously." And indeed, when this happened, I happened to be in Geneva talking to the Human Rights Council and Mr. Mendes, and I was absolutely terrified that the media would find out I was there in case they thought that I'd prompted these remarks. Needless to say, I did not, and these were independent views, not only of the Working Group on Torture, but also of the Human Rights Council itself, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Committee itself Against Torture, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and of course, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, all calling for an end, in one way or another, to the detention of children and their families, and the particularly offshore processing and the treatment of children in Nauru and, at that time, Christmas Island. Well, let's have a look at some facts. As of the 1st of April this year, and it's not easy for us to get information, which explains in part why we called the inquiry. But as pointed out, Australia is the only country in the world that mandates the detention of asylum seekers as the first option, including children. And indeed, for reasons that I will explain in a little bit more detail in a few minutes, Australian law under the Migration Act and the High Court in a case known as Al-Kateb in 2007 have confirmed that it is legally valid for Parliament to pass laws that require the indefinite and mandatory detention of those seeking refugee status in Australia. At the moment, or at least as of the 1st of April, we have 1,724 adults and 124 children in detention in Australia. 615 adults and 103 children on Nauru, but we have a very curious phenomenon that about 68 children are currently in Australia, and part of that number of 124 because they're receiving medical treatment themselves in Australia, or their families are receiving treatment and they've come as part of a family group to Australia. But the government's position is that each of them will be sent back to Nauru. In other words, they will under no circumstances be allowed to remain once that medical treatment has been completed. And there are also 989 male adults on Manus Island, no children, mercifully, at the moment on Manus. And just a little bit of background law, you will know that since the 19th of July 2013, government policy is that unauthorised maritime arrivals must go to Nauru or Papua New Guinea, that they will never be settled in Australia. We also have the extraordinary phenomenon that no refugee or asylum seeker has been assessed under refugee law since August 2012, and that we now have a backlog of 25,000 applications. So that is a community problem for Australia, and of course one of the greatest concerns from a human rights perspective is that by failing to assess their status as refugees, you have pretty much taken away the last vestige of respect that they could demand of the international legal system. And that matters a lot. We found in the detention centres throughout Australia and Christmas Island that they didn't expect a hotel, they didn't expect things to happen all that quickly. They knew it was going to be difficult and conditions would be difficult. But what has most disturbed people has been the sheer length of time that they've been detained and the fact that there is no pathway to their claim to respect as refugees under the current system. And that really has led to the kinds of consequences that I'll be explaining. Now the law is very clear, and the inquiry when we called it was not about the law. The law has been clear for decades, and we at the Human Rights Commission have been very vocal in talking about that law since 1992, when the then Labour government introduced mandatory and ultimately indefinite detention. So the law is very simple, and we could begin, and it's not inappropriate to begin, with the Magna Carta, the celebration of which we have this year, the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta, signed at Runnymede by King John, forced to by his rebellious barons in 1215. But you might remember it's a document, if you've ever had a look at it, a bit tedious, about how many cows you can have, what your responsibilities are as a serf to the lord of the manor, the weight and measure of a glass of wine, the breadth of a piece of cloth, the rights of widows on inheritance, and so on. But in the middle of this document, in the well-known Clause 39, there is a very important provision that no man may be detained or disseized of his rights without charge or trial by his peers. That is not an invention of a left-wing United Nations since the Second World War. It is an absolutely core principle of pretty well any legal system, but certainly the common law system that we've inherited and developed in Australia. No one may be detained without charge or trial. But that law, of course, has been much developed over the centuries, and particularly post-Second World War, with major international treaties, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Economic and Social Rights, the Convention Against Torture, but very particularly the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And many of the core principles of international law are included in this convention. And you can see the law is fairly straightforward. No detention arbitrarily. Children in detention environments should be treated with respect. They should not, it's obvious of course, not treated to torture or cruel and inhuman treatment or punishment. They should be detained only as a last resort and for the shortest appropriate period of time, and that every child has a right to life, to survival and to development. So the law, as a matter of international law, has been very clear. But we do have an exceptional position in relation to human rights law in Australia, and it is genuinely exceptional. We have very few constitutional protections for human rights in Australia. We have a right to freedom of religion, we have a right to vote, and the High Court has implied a right to political communication. But none of the other rights that we think we have actually find their place in the Australian Constitution. If you ask anybody in the Pitt Street Mall, do you have a right to freedom of speech, they will tell you, of course they do. But it's not easy to find the source of that right, and it exists more in culture and expectation than it does in strict law. As was pointed out, unlike every other common law country in the world, Australia has no Charter of Rights or Bill of Rights, and most of the treaties that we have ratified in the international environment have not been legislated by Parliament into Australian domestic law. There are some exceptions, and they apply to the Race Discrimination Convention, which was given domestic law in the Race Discrimination Act, and it applies to CEDAW, the Convention in relation to discrimination against women, and the Convention in relation to disabilities. Those are the three areas, race, sex and disabilities, where we've enacted legislation reflecting an international treaty. But all the major treaties, including the Convention on the Rights of the Child, are not part of Australian law. Also, exceptionally, our region is the only region in the world that doesn't have a regional treaty for human rights or a commission or a court to develop jurisprudence as to what human rights mean. So the end result is that we are relatively isolated from the language of human rights that applies in Europe and North America. Even our cousin New Zealand has a Human Rights Act. The Middle East have Human Rights Acts. Africa, Latin America, but not in our part of the world. And we see the consequences of that in many ways, including, of course, the very tragic executions of Australians and others in the last 24 hours or so. We have an odd phenomenon about the common law that the courts would normally apply the law by reference to common law principles, including basic human rights. But if the statute is clear, the courts must apply the words of Parliament in the statute. If there's no ambiguity, the courts have no other option. Now, the difficulty here is that very often legislation is ambiguous, and that leaves the courts a bit of freedom to apply broader principles of human rights or common law principles of freedoms. But where you look at a piece of legislation like the Migration Act, that has been amended and amended and amended to close every gap that the High Court has found over the decades, particularly in the last few years, that there's very little ambiguity left. How do we actually achieve human rights? Because I've painted a very grim picture, but the truth is that for the most part, Australia is a country where human rights are applied and accepted and understood. One of those ways is through the Parliamentary Scrutiny Committee. It's only been in existence for 3 years, but it does apply human rights standards and the international treaties to those parliamentary pieces of legislation. It's been a successful committee, and its reports to Parliament have been very useful ones, except that Parliament, in finally passing legislation on a party basis, always ignores the recommendations. Almost always, at least in this area of law. So it's not been a very effective role. But now we come to the role of the Australian Human Rights Commission, which really is a check and balance in relation to these processes. It's an independent statutory body. We're appointed, I'm appointed, and the commissioners are appointed by the Governor-General, but we're paid for by the taxpayer. We have a mandate, and I, as President, have a unique mandate to inquire into any act or practice, including that of the Commonwealth Government, that is inconsistent with human rights. But what is the definition of human rights? It is the international treaties, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and so on. But you'll be already asking the question in your own mind, well, how can that possibly work? I've just said that those treaties are not part of Australian law. And that is the great dilemma that I have. That my job is to call the government to, and others in the private sector obviously, but to call in this case the government to account by reference to the principles of public international law and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, specifically scheduled to our Act. But when I make the comments that a particular act is contrary to international law, the minister can say, well, that's all very interesting, but that treaty is not part of Australian law. You cannot go to a court and waive the Convention on the Rights of the Child and say, but we can't imprison these children because that's contrary to that convention. A court will say, very interesting, but look at what the Migration Act says, that allows you to do it. So we have a rather sort of schizophrenic position, or another way of looking at it is we're like ships passing in the night. We have a domestic system of law, but we have an international set of standards that it's my job to ensure we comply with. So it's an odd thing to do, but we try to do it. Every year we receive about 21,000 inquiries and complaints every year under the particular legislation on race, sex, disability, and then the domestic legislation on age. You cannot go to the court without coming to the Commission first, and we have 6 commissioners on age, disability, children, race, sex, broadly human rights, who have a predominantly advocacy role in relation to those particular portfolios. So that's pretty much how we operate. But then we come to the critical question, and the one that's been such a huge problem for the Commission and, of course, for me personally, and that is, why did we call the inquiry into children in immigration detention in the first place? Well, we did it, obviously, for the basic reason that we wanted to understand better what were the medical health impacts on children detained for significant periods of time. It wasn't to talk about the law, because it's settled and clear, and we've been doing it for decades. It was about what were the medical consequences. How could we examine and assess it? And we knew that by July 2013, after the huge and unprecedented surge of asylum seekers, as you know, coming to Australia during that year, there were nearly 2,000 children in mandatory detention. But they'd only been in detention for a matter of weeks, some of them 2 or 3 months. And as a matter of reasonable assessment of the law, when they're arriving by boat in poor condition, usually and typically on Christmas Island, it's not unreasonable for the government to hold them for a period of time for medical checks, for identity checks and security checks. And as lawyers, we wouldn't gainsay that. But we were concerned that these children needed to be moved to the Australian mainland, to be enrolled into schools, and for their claims and their parents' claims to refugee status to be assessed. But we also knew in July that an election was coming up very shortly, and indeed it was called and it was held in the second week of September. And by the time the election was called, the government had already moved 900 of those 2,000 into the community, leaving about 1,100. We then thought, well, we'll wait and see what the new government is going to do. If they release the children as the former government had done, then we don't need to go into a full inquiry mode. But what we found was that between the election in September and February, the numbers of children in detention remained pretty well static at 1,100. But what was also changing, as distinct from the static numbers of the children held, was that the children were now being held for, on average, 6 months, 7 months, 8 months. The time was getting beyond anything that one could accept. There was also a very high level of secrecy. Everything was now on water, a matter, and this magical phrase that lawyers hate to see so much, a matter of national security. We couldn't get access to any of the information that we had previously had from the earlier government, and there was a very high level of secrecy. And we were also concerned that there was by now a systemic, not a happen chance or individualistic, but systemic failure to comply with international law. Now, I won't take up your time with graphs and so on, but you can see that top line. This was the massive increase in the period of time for which children were being held, more than 3 months, 6 months or 12 months, but it was going up dramatically. So these were our terms of reference. What were the impacts of mandatory and indefinite detention on asylum seeker children? To what extent did this detention comply with law? What was the impact of lengthy detention? And we were also concerned about the particular phenomenon legally that the Minister for Immigration was also the guardian of the unaccompanied children. Well, the methodology was absolutely critical. And we really realised that before we started. We spent a lot of time with social scientists. Most of us in the Commission are lawyers. I certainly am, and most of the people I was working with were. But we readily understood that as this wasn't really about the law as such, and it was about the medical consequences, we needed an expert team to come with us. And I think that was probably the best judgment that we made, because it became very clear to us that by having senior medical members of the team, the judgments that we ultimately formed and formed during the process had a very high level of credibility. That when a senior medical person says, in my experience, every child on Christmas Island is sick, that is a judgment that carried enormous weight. So what we did was to bring, of course, other lawyers, people from my office, social scientists, but we brought 4 child psychiatrists and 5 paediatricians with us. I should say not all at the same visits, but we had 11 detention centre visits and 3 in my case to Christmas Island, but in each case we brought 1 child psychiatrist and 1 paediatrician. It was remarkable because all of this work was done pro bono. On their own time. We paid their expenses, but otherwise they didn't charge at all. And these visits are not only personally very draining, but you're there for a week and you can get badly stuck in the context of trying to get on or off Christmas Island, which has a more than ropey landing strip. And in fact, if I can give you a personal story, one of the things that rather horrified us was that the Department of Immigration officials refused to fly onto that with the planes and onto that landing strip, and tried to come at it from a different airline company from Australia, coming a shorter trip and landing in only particular circumstances. And they wouldn't travel with us because they thought it was all too dangerous. So we were slightly alarmed at that, but nonetheless we did survive. So we went to all of the detention centres all over Australia. and Christmas Island. We did not go to Nauru because my jurisdiction physically does not run to Nauru, and the minister would not allow me to go. But we do receive complaints from Nauru as part of our complaints function. So we had a lot of evidence from Nauru, and a chapter of our final report included Nauru, obviously because we're concerned about the egregious conditions in relation to the children. We also had 5 public hearings which were held both in Melbourne and in Sydney. We had a lot of people making submissions, 239 submissions, and 41 witnesses under oath, so that under the inquiry powers that I have as President, it's possible not only to compel evidence from the department that they were hitherto reluctant to give me, we could compel it, including CCT footage of the use of force in some instances, but also to ensure that every witness spoke under oath. So there was a sort of semi-judicial environment, and I'd say the witnesses took the matter very seriously. I invited the Minister Scott Morrison and the former Minister Chris Bowen to give evidence with my heart in my mouth, because I thought, what if they say no? Do I compel them? Which I wasn't looking forward to. And in fact, I might have chickened out, I'm not sure. But in any event, both agreed to come, and both made a statement under oath which was absolutely fascinating. They both agreed that detaining children as part of the government policy did not stop the boats or the drownings at sea, which, as you know, is the rhetoric. They insisted that there was no intent to use the children as part of the deterrence policy. And I thought this was very curious, because it's clear that in the public arena that linkage of ideas has been promoted at the political level. Why would you give evidence under oath to the contrary? And I thought about this a lot and read some cases, and it seems to me that one answer is something that is very important to lawyers and to those who understand the constitutional system, and that is that the only branch of government that is entitled to use any form of punishment or deterrence is the judiciary. The executive and the government does not have a punishment power, and they may not. Any detention must be by the courts, and under the doctrine of separation of powers must never be by the executive or by Parliament. So it was rather intriguing, and we might find out a little more about that in future. One of the things that was really vital to this process, in addition to bringing the medical profession with us, was that we had to decide whether to bring the media with us. Because of the slightly judicial nature of what we were doing and the seriousness of it, many judicial inquiries or semi-judicial inquiries will operate and conduct all of their work, and then they will complete their work, produce a report, and then have a launch with the media. But otherwise, it would be a fairly private exercise. We decided on advice that we wouldn't do that, because the advice was that if we finished the report and literally sort of dropped it in the hands of the attorney, waiting for him to submit it to Parliament, it could disappear and lose any traction with the public. Now, of course, we didn't know at the time that in giving a report to the attorney, he would fail to table it with Parliament until later in February this year, which meant that some of the data was already stale. But by bringing the media with us, it meant that we had sufficient media attention on the outcomes to give it some traction. So those were all of the kinds of methodological concerns that we had. But the other very important factor, and I think one reason why the decision has been made politically to attack the Commission and the report rather than its content, is that we relied to a very high degree on data from the Department of Immigration and from one of the service providers, the International Health and Medical Services, an international body that has been doing the medical work in all the detention centres, Christmas Island, Manus and Nauru. So we were very, very happy to be able to compel that evidence from the department, because it provided us with a baseline of data that we could then triangulate, if you like, with scholarship, published material, largely from the medical profession in medical journals, which has been coming out to a very high degree over the last few months, along with our own experiences. We also had primary evidence from the children themselves. We interviewed about 638 children and nearly 1,200 children and their parents who participated in the interview process. Now, obviously, we had to be very careful interviewing children, and each of these was a confidential matter. But we did this with a questionnaire that was developed by social scientists because we wanted to be absolutely certain that when we did make findings and recommendations, the work could not be criticised as not being methodologically sound. And we had trick or control questions in the questionnaire to make sure that we were getting as close to the truth as we could. And it's only been recently that I've understood that a primary basis for data collection of about 1,200 people is a very high sample in order to get to an accurate view of the outcome. So that helped us in being able to produce a report which was methodologically credible. And when I went to Geneva to present this report to the various bodies 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was really rather pleased that they said they had never received a report of this kind and depth and calibre before. Now, first of all, I sort of swelled with immodest pleasure at this. But then I realised that no other country in the world detains this number of children. Therefore, it was a pretty unusual thing to be doing in the first place. But nonetheless, it was received very favourably, and I was really quite chuffed about that. And that's an example of the questionnaire. I'm sure you all know far better than I do just how wonderfully truthful children are. We would go through this, and you can see the happy faces and the sad faces, and we tried to engage them in it, and they loved it. And if we accidentally circled the wrong one or we put the wrong number, the children would always insist that we go back and we get it right. They were meticulous, and they were simply remarkable to deal with the clarity with which they understood their position, but the sadness with which, of course, they understood what was happening to them, particularly their lack of access to schools on Christmas Island and for most purposes, Nauru as well. Now, I mentioned that we had control questions in here. It was quite an extensive questionnaire, but we did have to be cautious in case people would gild the lily, mislead us. And one of the control questions, after a lot of questions, was, do you think that the Soko guards who've been guarding you over these months, or in many cases years, have they treated you with respect? And we got something like an 85 to 90% response that the guards had treated them with respect. And we basically knew that to be true. So that if they told us about their illnesses, about the food, about the spiteful ways in which they were treated, the failures of all kinds systemically in relation to them, they would do that. But the answer to the question about the guards was often, almost invariably, they treated us with respect. Whereas if they said, no, they were cruel and they did other things to us, it may have been true in their case, but at least it was an indicator as to whether or not you were being broadly honest in the answer. Now, the public hearings, as I say, had a sort of semi-judicial feel to it. And in fact, this one here was at the Town Hall, South Melbourne Town Hall in Melbourne. And I was most impressed all over Melbourne, but including the Town Hall. There are great big banners up saying, welcome to refugees and asylum seekers. It was just a very, very welcoming and warm environment. Well, the government data alone, quite apart from anything we produced, demonstrated a key point, that detention, whether it's at Villawood or Darwin, Curtin, or any of the other detention centres, but obviously most particularly Nauru and Christmas Island, detention is a very dangerous place, especially for children. And the incidents reported by the department were 207 of actual self-harm, and we were completely astonished that the majority of those, as you can see, were actually children, which we found it very, very sad, but of course not something we'd really expected. Voluntary starvation, much fewer in relation to children, a threatened self-harm, a significant number, serious assaults, 233 assaults specifically involving children. And particularly worrying, 33 incidents of reported sexual assault, the vast majority of which, almost all, barring about 2 or 3, involved children. And that figure now has gone up significantly. Sexual assault cases were reported to us. We reported to the department and hoped that they would then investigate them. But those numbers have now gone up into the 50s of reported sexual assault involving children. And the Royal Commission into Sexual Abuse of Children, that's looking at institutional abuse, is now considering our evidence and the evidence of the department in terms of whether they expand that inquiry into the wider detention of children in these detention centres. Well, our findings, by the time we were reporting to the government, 726 children had been detained for more than 14 months, absolutely unprecedented globally and in Australia. But the figure that was probably the most disturbing was that 34% of the children in detention had moderately severe to very severe mental health problems, compared to fewer than 2% of children in Australia were they to present with a mental health problem. So it was astronomical, really. Now, partly, of course, in many cases, the trauma the children had suffered from the countries in which they'd come, the journey, and then to come to Australia and not to find the welcome that they had expected. I had remember one case in particular that really affected me. It was a rather wonderful, bright, intelligent 11-year-old girl from Sudan, and she told me quite quietly and composed that her family had been killed, her brothers killed, her parents killed, because of a failure by the father to give the daughters up to Al-Shabaab for slavery of one form or another. But a better off aunt in Kenya had managed to find the money to smuggle her out of Somalia, ultimately to the hands of people smugglers, and ultimately across the seas. And this young girl described all of this to me and how terrified she was on the boat, the fear of sharks, the fear of waves. She told me the story and I listened, and then she said, and I've been on Christmas Island for more than a year and I've not had a day in school. And that is when she burst into really uncontrollable tears, because she understood, as young people do, that not to have access to education was in many ways the cruelest thing that could happen to them, because if she missed her education, she would find it hard to catch up and she would be damaged, and her opportunities for the future, regardless of what happened in Australia, whether she was sent somewhere else. She had no real future if she couldn't have an education. And as somebody interested in education from my own perspective, and having been extraordinarily fortunate in my own education, I nearly cracked up myself. I really found it very, very difficult to hold it together, but I thought I didn't want something in the Daily Telegraph of President of the Australian Human Rights Commission in tears on Christmas Island. I thought was not going to be a very successful look. So, but these were stories multiplied hundreds and hundreds of times as we interviewed these children around Australia and on Christmas Island. We had findings of our own, based in part on departmental data and our own questionnaire, of high incidence of assault, sexual assault and self-harm involving children. Emotional and developmental disorders in the children caused by the deprivation of fact of detention, and exposure also to mentally ill adults. Many of them, we found 30%, and these are figures from the International Health and Medical Services that were on in all of the detention centres. They determined that 30% of adults had significant mental levels of mental illness. Now, as you can imagine, living in these effectively shipping containers or in tents in very, very close quarters, for children to be with mentally unwell parents in highly stressful situations was extremely damaging for everybody. In some instances, I was interviewing mothers who wouldn't make eye contact with their children. We're very happy for our staff from the Commission to care for the children because they weren't relating to their own children anymore. And sometimes, and I was surprised by this, and you may know the reasons far better than I, but it was the husbands were often caring for the children because the mothers had simply retreated to their cabins or tents and refused to get up, refused to eat, and refused to connect with their children. The other thing that tended to happen is that the guards, although they were respectful, tended to become the power figure. The psychology was fascinating, if rather horrible to observe, but the guards were the ones with the power, and the children started to ignore their parents and to respond only to the guards. And that broke down family and parental relations and made things a lot worse. As far as illness was concerned, the paediatricians, child psychiatrists that came with us agreed that most of the children were sick. There were endless coughs and colds. I'm not a medico, but to my eyes, these children in front of me when I was trying to talk to them were obviously sick. And if that were true here in a suburb in Sydney, you would be wanting to be sure that child had medical attention reasonably quickly. Others, of course, were far worse than coughs and colds. They had huge lumps in their throats. They had all sorts of illnesses that had not been treated in their own countries, curvature of the spine. We came across families who were completely deaf and dumb because they had never been given hearing aids in the countries in which they came, and the whole of the family had the same genetic disability. Of course, I should say, perhaps painting this very, very stark picture, that when we did come across this group of those people with that disability, we were able to approach the minister and say, this is a terrible situation. They need to be released into the community. They've got to learn Auslan to be able to communicate, and they've got to be properly assessed to see if they can start to hear and have a benefit of proper treatment. And behind the scenes, they were in fact released, and they did in fact get a humanitarian visa, and they did get the treatment. Now, the minister would say to me in relation to that problem, along with some others, I don't want you telling the press about this or going on the 7:30 report and talking about these cases, because I don't really want anyone to know that we're doing this. So you can see what a strange environment it is, that thousands or certainly hundreds of children being detained, thousands over the years, but some cases being treated on a humanitarian basis. One that we all remember, I know in the Commission very well, was of 3 Sudanese girls, all children under 18, and finally with appeals from their own community in Australia, from the refugee advocates, members of the department who were very concerned about them, the minister very quietly agreed that they should be again given a release on bridging visas, but basically we were all hoped that they would keep very quiet about it, because there was in honesty, no particular reason why they should be released and others were not. So we hoped it would be very quiet, but I was rather ultimately bemused by the fact that within a couple of weeks they were all down at the Sydney Opera House doing selfies and putting their pictures on Facebook. So it was out there, but it did, of course, create the problem that the children they'd left behind and the families they'd left behind were still there. And so when I went back, they'd say, but how can this happen? And one of the other things I found, just as a very personal level, was interviewing the unaccompanied children, who very often were males, typically young boys, 15, 16 or 17, and I would spend time with them, and they were about as edgy, difficult to get on with as my teenage son. He's grown up now, fortunately, but just exactly the same as any child that you would ever come across at that stage. And they weren't flattering me, they weren't going to say anything nice, they hadn't learned yet how to manipulate people. They were very clear. These were disgusting positions to be in. They wanted to be assessed as refugees, they wanted to get out in the community. When I came back the second time and the third time, they'd say, well, what use are you? What have you done for us? But I found their truthfulness wonderfully refreshing. But sadly, of course, a number of those children that I knew, of young boys unaccompanied, have now gone to Nauru, because, as you know, all children are off Christmas Island now. And it was, I think, one of the more disgraceful aspects of the discussion of this subject, that the Australian public was told that Christmas Island or in relation to children, had been closed. All the children were off Christmas Island. What they didn't mention was that a very high number of those were sent to Nauru. So it has been a battle to try to get the facts right, because we haven't always been able to get them to be precise, and to ensure that the Australian public's remained engaged in some of these questions. One of the issues in relation to unaccompanied children is, of course, the role of the Minister for Immigration. We have argued, as lawyers are bound to argue, that it is entirely contrary to every principle of law to have the person making the ministerial decisions about children also being their guardian. But the Minister said to me, what's the point of appointing and paying for a guardian for the unaccompanied children when, as Minister, I will make up my own mind what I'm going to do with them anyway? So I think that was a rather chilling phenomenon. Now, we weren't allowed to take photographs, but you can see these are all reconstituted shipping containers, and in each one they're about 3 metres by 2.5 metres. And you would typically have 2 to 4 people, 2 adults and 2 children within that tiny space. Now, during the public hearings, one of the ministers challenged me and said, you've said these places are prison-like. Well, in truth, they're worse than prisons, because if you're in prison in Villawood, you've been charged, you've had a trial, you've probably appealed, and you're serving your sentence. You've probably got a prison cell on your own, you've got access to education, you've got access to your lawyer and weekly visits by the family or members of your community, and you're usually eating food that's consistent with your religious or other preferences. These people have none of those things, and typically, and worrying from our point of view, from a human rights point of view, almost no access to lawyers. And in fact, the notorious and true story is that the most the department would do was to give an asylum seeker on Christmas Island the yellow pages, but no more, which we, as from a legal point of view, found particularly distressing. I don't need to tell you that cramped conditions of this kind lead to the spread of disease, and that was very, very obvious even to a lay person. Now, the picture, as I say, we weren't allowed to take pictures. These are ones that are used by the department. But if you can imagine the scene where people are sitting outside these cabins because it's so hot, the air conditioning units in the cabins don't work typically, or they're dripping water. They're very ineffective. But they sit outside and they talk, of course. But children are everywhere, and the conditions, you just look at those conditions and you can't believe that this is really what Australia has put these people through. And so this looks relatively pristine. These are just more pictures of the use of force. These in Notre, we had a particular chapter of the report that looked at the conditions for 15 months and now longer. Families are sleeping in these tents. There are no buildings for asylum seeker refugees on Nauru, although the staff do have concrete facilities. Here, people are in tents with very little privacy. And again, chronic problems of health, mental health, and high numbers of self-harm, sexual assault, hunger strikes, and so on. And they continue, and you hear them in the media all the time. These are very typical of the conditions. This is Dr. Chan at the third public hearing talking about over 70% of presentations to our clinics were related to the environment. Skin infections that in Australia would be very simple to treat and curable on Nauru, they become chronic, recurrent and debilitating, so that we see commonly staphylococcal skin infections related to heat and humidity and close living quarters. I would see a lot of children and adults with dehydration and the secondary effects of that, including recurrent urinary tract infections and headaches. This just gives you, again, just a sense of it, because the numbers and the statistics don't really give you a sense of what it was like. But these are the pictures that the children drew, and you'll see that we've got sticky tape over what would otherwise be their names. Most of the children, and these ones in particular, did not put their names on their drawings. They put their boat number. And when you ask to speak to them, they'll put the boat number. In fact, I remember talking to a group of asylum seekers from Iran, and one man who wanted to ask a question got up and began by saluting me and then giving me his boat number. It was truly shocking to see how they had been stripped of their individual personalities because people couldn't get their minds across these names that were different from Anglo-Australian names. I think that we have complained, of course, about this, as have others, and I think that that is now changing. They're trying to make sure that the children are known by their names, but it was very shocking in the early days of this inquiry that this should be the case. There are all sorts of stories. This is from Nauru, but this one, I'm a 16-year-old girl who's tired of life. I want to kill myself. Please take my cry to the world. We're calling on all journalists. They talk of everybody crying at night. Some rather spiteful policies that there is a head count of all of the asylum seekers in the detention centres at different stages of the day, including at 11 o'clock at night and 4 o'clock in the morning and so on, and searchlights are shone in their faces to make sure that the right people are in the right beds at the right time, but all designed in a way to dehumanise and to strip away their integrity and dignity as human beings. Well, we finally produced a draft report to the department in October, and we went through a process of feedback from the department. One of the severe criticisms from the department was that we had no right to use the voices of the children. And we said, well, that is the primary source. So long as it can be correlated with other facts, it is fair to use the words of the children. But the department said it was highly emotive, that it was done with a biased purpose, and that we ought not to have used that material. Well, I'll leave you to think about whether that is appropriate or not. As I say, we gave a final printed report to the Attorney-General in early November, and under the law, the Attorney has 15 sitting days to table it. It was tabled on the last possible day at after 8 o'clock. I've been waiting in my office, along with all of us in the Commission, on that last day in February, and I'd finally got in the car and gone home, only to miss the tabling, which, of course, was at the last moment of that parliamentary sitting, so it avoided any parliamentary debate about the report. The key messages then are, and this is a lawyer's point, but I'm sure you understand it at the broader level, that we, at international law and in any moral sense, have full responsibility for these children in detention, that we are damaging them, that our findings are, we believe, robust and based on credible evidence, but much more positively, as the numbers, in fairness, of the children in detention are going down dramatically now that temporary protection visas have been agreed to by the Senate, the numbers are dramatically changing, and I do believe the Minister in saying that those numbers will continue to decline in Australia, but they may very well increase, ironically and sadly, in Nauru and Manus. But it is an opportunity for change. In other words, if the report is nothing more than a document of record, to be challenged, of course, by scholars or commentators, we welcome it. But it's a document of record, and we hope that eventually all of the children and their families will be released, and we hope that is true in relation to Nauru and Manus Island, that pathways to settlement are created, that their claims to refugee status are assessed. We know that 85 to 90% of those claims will be valid claims meeting the definition of a refugee at international law. And indeed, if one questioned that at all, firstly, that was true in the past, but quite ironically, the Papua New Guineans and the Nauruans have been assessing refugees for some months now, and they too have a figure of about 85% of claims being valid claims. But of course in Australia we haven't done this for more than, or about 2.5, nearly 3 years. We've not done it. So it's an opportunity for change. A lesson can be learned that detaining children does not stop the boats. It's a damaging policy. It's an extremely expensive one if you want to look at the budgets, horrifyingly expensive, but it is contrary both to international law and to every moral view that one would have of the treatment of children. The responses from the legal profession and from the medical profession along with the universities, civil society, advocacy groups, religious groups, educational groups, has been overwhelmingly supportive. And that's been very, very gratifying. The UN, of course, has taken the matter up, and it is not to be forgotten, of course, that Australia is now seeking a seat on the Human Rights Council. We undergo what's called the Universal Periodic Review for our human rights record in November, and I do think that there will be a considerable attention given to the continued position in relation to Manus Island and Nauru, given that these people are Australia's responsibility as a matter of international law, and whether or not, of course, there are families still in detention, but also the question of assessment and those on temporary protection visas as distinct from permanent visas, and all the problems that are going to go with the community. But we also, of course, have had a very negative response, both from the government and from sections of the media, from the Fairfax press, from the News Corp press, and in particular one newspaper, and from some of the shock jocks. That's been unfortunate, but nonetheless we've really had to deal with it. There has been damage to the Commission, sadly, but we feel that no human rights body in the world could have turned its back on these asylum seekers, and we hope that the public will read the report and will make up its own mind as to whether or not it's credible, whether the evidence is acceptable, and whether we can persuade future governments to repeal the mandatory detention policy, to develop a more humane and safe policy, both for Australia and for those asylum seekers. So thank you all very much for listening.
Okay, so we'll just open up the floor to questions now, probably for about 10 or 20 minutes.
Thanks very much, Professor Triggs, for your talk. I guess I've got two questions. The first is, I was interested to read an article yesterday in The Guardian likening the quote that you said, Tony Abbott said he's sick and tired of being lectured to by the UN, is identical to a quote that a South African leader said towards the end of the apartheid in the 60s. And I guess my question is, what do you think the reason is that Australia, compared to our neighbours across the ditch in New Zealand, who are more socially progressive, why is Australia, I guess, not as socially progressive in all of these sort of human rights acts? And the second part of my question is, or the second question is, what do you see as a solution to deaths at sea, especially recently the deaths off Italy?
Well, with regard to the first, I think it's fair to say that historically, and for most of my legal career, Australia has been a good international citizen. And I sort of cut my teeth at law school in the early 60s on Doc Everett from Australia, who worked with Helena Roosevelt to draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He was a rather irascible, difficult man, but absolutely determined about how the UN Charter should look like, how peace could be maintained as a matter of the rule of law. And he was also, and it's not always understood, but as an Australian it was phenomenal that he was the President of the General Assembly when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed without a single negative vote. And his influence in ensuring that was the case was very, very powerful. But the reason I go back to that much history is that pretty much from then on, for the following decades, Australia was a leader in drafting, negotiating, and ultimately signing and ratifying all of the major treaties that I've been talking about. And we had marvellous people of my generation, at least, like Gareth Evans, Minister for Foreign Affairs, made sure we signed and ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which underpins a lot of our work at the Commission. And that was maintained through the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and right up to the beginning of the 21st century with, for example, the Rome Statute for the creation of an international criminal court that holds individuals responsible for serious breaches of human rights law, which I have reminded the camp commandants on occasions, not with great enthusiasm on their part, but nonetheless, there is now, it's not just the state or the government that's responsible for egregious breaches of human rights, but it's every individual. Every person who turns their back on this and ignores it is responsible, and we know that from Nuremberg. So, historically, we've had a good record. So your question is how and why has this changed? And it changed with a conflation of, in my view, it's purely supposition, I'm not a political scientist, but you'll remember in 2001 we had the babies overboard, or the children overboard story under the Howard government. And that government took that up. It was proven not to be true, but it didn't matter. And one of the things I've learned in this job is, politically, you can say what you like. It can be completely false. But if you gain the political advantage in the short term, it doesn't matter that some weeks or months later it's disproved, because you've gained your advantage and it's water off a duck's back. It doesn't matter. So we have that phenomenon and the Tampa crisis. But later that year, we had 9/11, which really altered the worldview. And then we had the coalition of the willing in relation to Iraq, and of course the landing of troops in Afghanistan, and the longest war Australia's ever been involved in Afghanistan. So you had this series of events which allowed political leaders of both major parties to conflate the idea of an influx of asylum seekers with terror, with fear, with criminality, and we found the use of these phrases, jumping the queue and others, and the dog whistling. And what I come back to in my own understanding of this is a very weak level of political leadership, both at of both major parties. Had we got strong leadership to say, we will not be terrorized by this, we will acknowledge our responsibilities. The number of asylum seekers coming is tiny relative to Jordan, where I was a year or so ago. The Jordanian population is 6 million. They've now got more than 500,000 refugees coming across their porous borders from Syria, and it's even worse in Lebanon and in Turkey. They are bearing the brunt of international conflicts where we have played our own role of responsibilities. Why do we expect to have a war or take troops into fight in Iraq, but be surprised that we have refugees as a consequence of that conflict? Now, I'm not saying one thing necessarily leads to the other, but in fact it does and has done in relation to that war. And Syrian refugees, Afghani refugees are still the largest numbers of refugees we're considering. Why are we surprised that we have Sri Lankans who leave after a ghastly civil war in Sri Lanka? And so on. Of course, we can mention the Sudan, Somalia. Now we see the leakage of the terrorism from Somalia into Kenya, and the horrible catastrophes that have been occurring there. Why are we surprised? And yet we say we will close our borders, which is effectively what we've done through the use of force. And we've thrown the problem back to Indonesia, which of course already takes very high numbers of unauthorised arrivals of one kind or another. By the way, it's not at all surprising that we are not getting the kind of diplomatic engagement with Indonesia that one would have hoped for, given that they're our closest neighbour and a very big, and very powerful and very important one. Why do we think that we can get away? Anyway, it's a terribly long answer to your question. Now, so that's partly why. In other words, what I'd say as an international lawyer is we were a real leader, punching well above our weight, up until 2001. Then we saw that loss of bipartisanship and, in my view, a serious failure of leadership. If we had leadership, we could work our way through this. I'm certain that if Mr. Abbott woke up tomorrow morning and said, we are going to carry out our responsibilities to these people and we're going to treat them consistently with our obligations, you could bring the Australian public with you if it dealt with properly. But that's not happening. But I do believe it could happen. And so I haven't really given up hope. Now, your other question was, I've forgotten.
Deaths at sea, particularly across the Africa.
Well, in response to our report, one of the classic answers repeated over and over again is this government has been effective in stopping the drownings at sea, and we should have credit for that. And we do give credit for that. It was horrible. I think all Australians wanted the deaths at sea to stop. But this was not the way to do it. And there's no accounting. We don't know how many people's lives are being destroyed because we've pushed back. We'll never know that. Yes, we need proper border controls, but we should be doing this collaboratively with Indonesia and with Malaysia and with Sri Lanka, so that we are jointly patrolling these seas, we're picking up boats and maybe taking them back to the nearest land. But the only solution is, in my view, is to work more comprehensively with the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. The $3.5 billion that we spent last year on offshore processing and border patrol, I think give at least half of it to UNHCR and then work with them in the region to get a proper approach. But also we've got to work in Syria and Iraq, and we have got to work not with guns but with help. Because when you have conflict, you have refugees. And we have a tiny number in our region, 1%. Relative to the whole. The Secretary-General has reported 50 million people displaced or asylum seeker refugees last year in the community. So it's a global problem and we need to discuss it. We've got to get the political will to discuss this at a global level. And so that does bring me back again to this problem of leadership.
You did allude to this a little bit before, but you didn't discuss it in depth. I can't help but see this issue as relating to the erosions of the power of the judiciary, fundamentally. And I think you really see that in sort of legislature coming and stomping all over it with sort of redefining the migration zone in Australia, things like that. What can Australians do, or what can organisations like the High Court do in order to re-establish the role of the judiciary in order to, I guess, remedy this particular issue?
Yes, well, I wouldn't have raised this given that I'm in the Notre Dame Medical School. But you've raised a very, very important question, because my view is that we have an abuse of executive discretion, an abuse of Parliament, and a diminution in the capacity of the High Court to give effect to core human rights, and I go back to the Magna Carta. These are what's called the principle of legality, but basically one of the most vital of them is you do not detain people without charge or trial. It's absolutely fundamental. Now, somebody who's mentally ill and is not fit to plead, somebody who is dangerous to themselves and others can be detained on administrative detention. But it's for very limited periods of time with judicial scrutiny and scrutiny of the medical professional social workers. So you've got a system for managing it. Now, what about the High Court? The High Court has been squeezed out, but if you've been following it, you'll notice that every time the High Court finds a chink, like the Malaysia solution being illegal because Malaysia wasn't a party to the Refugee Convention, every time they find a chink, what happens?
Migration Act.
But what do they do? What does the government do? They go straight back to Parliament. So I have a very interesting question, and it's a rather radical one. What do you do in a democratic society like ours when Parliament, both major parties in Parliament, pass laws which are contrary to the law? What do you do? Now, my legal colleagues will say, well, look, that's the system. Parliament is sacrosanct. That's the will of the people. Through elections, you can chuck them out at the next election. But that's not actually happening. What do you do? And as a lawyer, I would have seen the High Court as being, or the Federal Court, because they obviously have jurisdiction in these matters as well, I would have seen that as being a safeguard. But the problem is that they're so constrained by, in my view, a rather restrictive view of their powers, that is, they will only apply the strict language of the law. And if the Migration Act says X, that's what they'll do. But something really interesting happened 3 weeks ago, if I can take up your time to tell you about this, because it's never happened before. It's absolutely phenomenal. It's had almost no public discussion at all. Although I did send an op-ed to the Australian, which to my amazement they published, but I don't think anybody understood it. But I'll tell you why no one understands. There's a great writ that emerged from about the 12th or 13th century in English legal history, which is called a writ of mandamus. And what mandamus is an instruction to the minister that the minister or the government official must meet their statutory obligations. They must carry out their duties. It's almost never ordered by the High Court of Australia against the Australian government, because the Australian government usually abides what the High Court tells it to do. But in this case, the High Court's taken the position, relatively recently as well, in what's called the S4 case, that the minister can do one of two things. He can either deport somebody, or he can make a decision to give them a temporary protection or now permanent protection visa. But you can't hold them indefinitely and do neither. And that's a very recent decision, a few months ago, 6 or 8 months ago. But in this particular case, the minister didn't do anything. So the Chief Justice of Australia, Robert French, issued a writ of mandamus and said to the minister, you will ensure that either you deport this person, and he couldn't be deported because he was stateless, no other country would take him. You've got to give him a visa. Well, the minister came back and said, well, I'm not giving him a visa because he's an unauthorised maritime arrival, which is circular. You're going around in circles. The reason he's there is because he's an unauthorised. We all held their breath to see what the High Court would do, but unanimously, not a single judge dissented. Unanimously, the High Court of Australia said, you will abide by that order. You must now give him a visa to stay in Australia. Now, I haven't heard the end of the story because I don't know if the minister's actually given it to him. But that is never, to my knowledge, ever happened. It's very rare indeed for the Chief Justice and then the unanimous High Court to insist that the minister carry out his duties under the statute. So I think we'll see a little bit of change. But your core point is a vital one, and it does worry me. You know, if I was on the streets as a student in the 60s on the Vietnam War, which we all thought was huge fun being out in the streets complaining about the government, we didn't understand what the war was about. We certainly had no idea what we were talking about. And we talked about existentialism and Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir and threw our bras away. We put them back on again, I'm sorry to say. That's the environment that I grew up in. And I can't understand why we're not demonstrating out here against a government that won't abide by absolutely core principles of our democratic system, and does so, unfortunately, with the support of both parties and the support of extreme right-wing views. And that's where we are politically, and legally it's very hard to find a solution to this erosion of the power of the courts.
I just wanted to make a comment about inquiry aftermath, and in that picture you have a doctor beside you, a child psychiatrist.
Yes.
And I don't think you should have damage to the Commission there, because I think anyone who saw some of the very disrespectful questioning that you received would only see the way you responded with such dignity. And what has come is an amazing partnership with doctors, and our annual College of Physicians meeting is now called Breaking Boundaries, Creating Connections, and the whole keynote address is about refugee and asylum seeker health, and we're going to release a policy. So one of the things I think is about the aftermath is a wonderful partnership between doctors and the Human Rights Commission, and you've enabled that to happen, and I think it's terrible how this has happened, but I think you've raised a level of importance, and for all Year 1 students there'll be a really important lecture on neurosciences and brain development and the long-term effects clinically coming your way next Thursday.
Thank you. Well, Elizabeth, I really appreciate your comment, because I should have made that even more strongly than I tried to. You didn't do medicine because you're interested in law or policy or politics. You did it because you care about your patients and what you can do for humanity. So it's not a natural thing for you to be wanting to try to understand some of the things that I'm talking about. But I think this relationship that developed with Elizabeth Elliott and Karen Shui and Sarah Miles and a number of the other medical practitioners has been extraordinary. And we've been really delighted to have the various colleges of psychiatry and paediatricians all now doing what doesn't really come naturally, but drafting media releases and statements to confirm the validity of our report. So it's been fantastic. Yes, this lady. Sorry, you're in charge. You're in charge.
Professor Triggs, thank you so much for coming and speaking to us tonight. I just wanted to ask, what do you think, or what would you advise a group of medical students to do on this issue? What would you like to see us do as a response?
Well, thank you. I really would like, I don't want you in the streets, please don't take that. You're getting a lot of trouble with that. What I would like is for you to speak up on the basis of medical evidence. In other words, it's not anecdotal, it's not sentimental, it's based on the evidence that you have because you have special expertise in understanding this. So understanding, as I use it, the neurological, I think, effect on these children. Study it, come to this lecture and speak up. If you have this wonderful global health conference in Perth, get it on the agenda. So that, because the future lies with your generation, there's no doubt about that. And I think that if you bring to your practices as you go out into the working environment, if you bring some understanding of legal standards and basic rights, you're in a better position to speak up. But I think that's probably, or an op-ed, those sorts of things, writing to your backbenchers. It does matter. Backbenchers do matter, I've discovered, and so has Mr. Abbott. So I think that, those are the things that you can do. I don't. You choose. I don't know.
Just following on from that, being a medical student now, in the future, we will have to deal with the fallout from this situation.
Yes, you will.
What do you think is going to be the size of that fallout, and how should we sort of prepare ourselves? I mean, going to lectures is great, but...
Well, that's a very, very important question, because that is really where we see this moving. On the mainland Australia, putting aside Manus and Nauru, we see the problem. It's already emerging that members of the medical profession are coming to us and saying that people are presenting in their surgeries and they're dealing with children who are very damaged. And schools, headmistresses, principals, teachers are increasingly now ringing us up and saying, I've got this child in my class and they're damaged, they're years behind. Children are bedwetting, they've got nightmares, they've got no education, and that's not entirely Australia's fault, but nonetheless, how do the teachers handle it? So I think it is something that I'd like to see the profession be alert to, so that whether you're a general practitioner or you're in a hospital or whatever context, you're alert to it. You see it, you recognise it when it comes through, and you can then hopefully get these children the extra support that I think they're going to need. But that's a key issue. We're very worried about something like 26 or 27,000 people who are drifting around with no work rights, no education. They charge them international student rates to do a course at university. Or to do, I think English language is more readily available, but any training or tech training is available, but they've got to pay the prices. And of course, if they're not allowed to work, most of them, or haven't got work, it's impossible. So I think we expect to see much greater community problems as we get past this particularly egregious stage of detention.
Thank you so much for your lecture, Professor Triggs. I just wanted to ask, since Australia's been found in breach of the UN's 1951 Refugee Convention and also under the International Court of Justice, and if our current government isn't responding to it, much more so stating that it's sick of being lectured to by the UN and even more so the International Court of Justice, what do you think it would take for the government to do something if they're not even responding to this level of international power?
Well, in the international environment, persuasion, diplomatic persuasion, can be very effective. And one of the impressions I got in Geneva was sort of senior people coming up. They weren't attacking Australia. They were just saying, we don't understand Australia. And I kept saying, well, this will pass. This will change. And I think it will. But it's completely out of character for Australia and inconsistent with our reputation. But I'm afraid I'm avoiding the real answer to your question, which is international law cannot force Australia to abide by those principles. We do not, international law is not a sophisticated system of law in the sense that a domestic system of law is there. It would be my life's dream to see that there will be some mechanisms for doing it, but at the moment, international law works because there's a reciprocity. It usually works because law of the sea works because we've got shipping lanes through the archipelagos. We abide by wheat contracts and trade contracts because reciprocally we get benefits from it. And that's always been the case. But sadly, human rights seems to have been taken away from that. But of course it's very dangerous for Australia because we have bilateral relations with China on human rights. And we have bilateral arrangements with Vietnam and we were developing them with Indonesia. But very hard to make those reciprocal benefits work when one party simply pulls out. And that's pretty much what's happened here. And in fact, it was very interesting. I met one of the senior people from Human Rights Watch in Washington this morning, and he was saying that there was much indignation at Mr. Abbott's suggestion in Europe while he was in Turkey that maybe the Europeans might care to adopt Australia's policies in relation to the Mediterranean. And the response from him and from the political leaders in Europe was, well, thank you, but we have a human rights treaty, we have a human rights court, and even UKIP in the United Kingdom sees that as too far right for them to adopt as a policy. So they want to solve the drownings. They've got to solve the drownings. And they've got to find a way to do it because it's intolerable, and the last deaths have been beyond anybody's worst nightmare. But it does show up, this incident with Mr. Abbott's suggestion that they follow Australia shows up the fact that we are well out of line. We're really exceptionalist in the way in which we're going about this. Most other countries simply couldn't do it because of their domestic adoption of human rights principles. And so that's why I went into it a little bit in the early part of this presentation, to understand why we're so unusual in international law standards. But normally the answer to your question is reciprocal benefit. It works because of that, but it breaks down when one party pulls out, and that's really what's happened here.
Do you think that Australia will at one stage have a charter or a Bill of Rights, and that would be introduced into Australian law?
I think we should, but the political will for a Bill of Rights is just not there, and the case has to be made for it. But one of the reasons that you might remember Father Frank Brennan did a national consultation process for a Bill of Rights a few years ago, and his recommendation was that we should have a charter or Bill of Rights. But it was rejected by the Labor government at that time, and it did so for a very special reason. And that is that there's a deep suspicion in Australia of judges who would be creative lawmakers. Now, that is completely misconceived. Judges are lawmakers, they do make law. That's where our civil rights came from. That's where common law came from, because judges made it. It wasn't a code, it wasn't statute, it was judges in the 13th, 14th and 15th centuries that made the very laws that built today's modern democracy. But that understanding is not here in Australia. There's a deep, deep resistance of the idea that the Federal Court or the High Court could creatively interpret laws in a way that was consistent with international law. So the idea of a charter was simply dropped, and no government's taken it up since. But you also have people who have spoken very strongly against it, including the Premier of New South Wales, Bob Carr, who is adamantly opposed to a Bill of Rights. So until we get a real change in political will, and again in leadership, we won't have a Bill of Rights in Australia, and we'll have to find it in these nooks and crannies, or by culture, by the public, saying, we don't understand any of this law, but we do want our right to freedom of expression. So we've had a marvellous debate, really, in the last few days, rather sadly, context, but a very interesting debate about the the tweeting by the sports journalist in relation to Anzac. Now, they were cruel comments that would have offended most Australians, and particularly deliberate given that they were in the context of Anzac Day. But how far does the right to freedom of speech go? Now, we're having that discussion not because it's in the Constitution or in the law anywhere. You won't find a law anywhere on this, apart from in the Race Discrimination Act, but I won't go there for the moment. That's the only one. But if you try to find a basis for it, it isn't there. It's there because it's part of our legal culture. It's ephemeral, but it's there, and we all believe in it. And it does work most of the time.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk again. I had a question regarding the temporary protection visas.
Oh, yes.
I guess I just wanted to understand why there were limitations on these people accessing healthcare and accessing, relatively, like jobs and all the other things that we take for granted, and why there was that limitation, and what we can do to, sort of make that.
Well, the worst problem with temporary protection visas is that they're temporary, and you've got to go through the whole thing all over again. Now, a number of other European countries do have the concept of a temporary protection visa, and at the end of the 3 years, if the conditions continue, and invariably they have done, then they become permanent. So it's a pathway, and it works. It was under bridging visas you couldn't work. They're the ones that are been in the worst position because they can't work, they can't get access to, so they could get Medicare. They could get basic medical care, and the children are enrolled in schools, so those were important. And they get, I think, 85% of New Start, something like that. But, of course, we've only had temporary protection visas relatively recently, and you know how we got them. Both the Labor Party have been adamantly opposed to temporary protection visas because they are temporary and they're destabilising and they don't give an ultimate result. Whereas if you've been adjudged to be a refugee, you should have a permanent protection visa. That will be the normal course, and that's pretty much what Australia would normally do. But the Minister, Scott Morrison, would not give visas to anybody because he flatly refused to give permanent protection visas. And you'll remember that he introduced it to the Senate, and on the vote of one, I think the sports representative on the Senate was finally persuaded that he would cast his vote with the government to allow them to get temporary protection visas. But it's still Labor's view, I understand, that they don't support temporary protection visas. What we were particularly concerned about was that the minister said he would not let the children out until he got temporary protection visas. And that, I think, was a disgraceful breach of the law, to hold the children hostage to achieving an outcome in the Senate. Now, ultimately that happened, and it has to be acknowledged that now they've got temporary protection visas, the government's been getting the children out in very considerable numbers. And that's been a massive improvement. And we think probably most of them will be out within the next few weeks or months, and I'm quoting the Minister and the head of the department just a week or so ago. So I think that part of the problem will go, but what we're going to end up with is the community problem, because they're there on temporary protection visas, and they'll have to go through the whole ghastly process again to determine whether conditions in their countries continue to be bad, and I haven't noticed any of them improving. They'll get the same, but the hope then, at least the hope is, that they would then get a permanent protection visa.
Yes, sir, I think you had a question.
Professor, isn't one of the sad facts legitimises the current political atmosphere, the Anglo fear of Islam?
Yes, I think so. But I think that fear could be managed with proper leadership. I think that there will be a segment of the Australian community that will use the high numbers of asylum seekers coming, being Muslims. They will use that as a sort of xenophobic, racist view. There will be that rump that will always do it. But I think if we had political leadership that made it very, very clear indeed that Muslims are part and parcel of our multicultural society, that they will be treated equally in terms of their needs for access to protection, and that many will be Muslims because they come from countries where the conflicts are. I think that if we had leadership that made that clear and distinguished terrorism over here and that classical view of what a terrorist looks like, from leaky boats and people coming off, and separated the two issues. But I think that some members of our political environment have been prepared to allow that conflation of ideas. And then we have phrases like, you know, you've got to join Team Australia. Well, what was all that meant to mean?
I think it was meant to mean very clearly what it did.
Well, the Islamic community have taken it that way. And so again, you have the religious groups coming together and trying to make sure that that's not the implication. But when you've got senior politicians with access to the media all the time, hanging on to a right-wing number in the party room, then this is the kind of dog whistling that they'll do. And I keep coming back again and again, because I now see it more clearly than I did before I started this job, how important leadership is. That if we had leadership with clear principles, willing to take on it's not easy to deal with 50,000 asylum seekers arriving all in a short space of time. It was always going to be difficult. But if with good leadership we could do it, and I have to say at a fraction of the cost that we've actually engaged by doing it the way we've chosen to do it. Yes, we need border patrols. Yes, we need regional approaches. But we could have done this in a much more sophisticated and nuanced way than we have, instead of which we're now in this appalling situation. We're actually deeply disturbing an otherwise settled and peaceful group of our Australian community, because they are now very, very worried about what all this means to their future in Australia. And we're seeing some evidence of radicalisation of some young people. So that's very sad. But I think leadership and willingness to take the tough decisions and to bring it back to a bipartisan position. Why would governments tear each other apart over this policy? We should go back to that pre-2001 position when all sides of government agreed broadly on migration policy, even if it was a tough policy, but ones that meets our international standards of basic humanity. You don't have to be a lawyer to understand any of this. It's just not, it's very clear to anybody that you don't treat children and their families in this way.
Perhaps just one more question.
And I guess it's a pretty good question for conclusion. Where to now? And I guess what role does your report? Where do you go from now, from here? I guess, and what is your role in regards to educating the general public about your report?
Well, where to from here? I think it was probably important to us that the Moss report, which was of course directed or requested by the government in relation to Nauru, completely confirmed all our findings. So that was important too for us. We will continue, of course, to promote these findings. I think in the short term, we won't have a domestic problem of children in detention. And most adults, apart from the ASIO security ones and one or two others, that are not adjudged to be refugees, but where Iran won't take them back, for example. Nor, I think, will Sri Lanka anymore. So that we're going to have a rump of problems, but they're not the key. Well, they're going to be difficult cases to handle, but that's not the main problem. So where do we go from here? Well, we will, of course, have to keep our eye on Nauru and Manus Island, but mainly my job will be to educate. And to get out to the schools and the universities, as I have been, talking about the inquiry and asking people to look at it critically, read it, but make sure that this never happens again. Now, at a broader level, I think we have to go to regional diplomacy, and we have to work with UNHCR. And I think that's really the only thing we can do. I mean, one of the very great concerns that I've got is that because we've attracted so much political opprobrium from the government, we're waiting with bated breath to see what they do to our budget in May. So, although we are an independent statutory body, we are pretty toothless with no money. And that's, to be honest, my fear now. That we will lose. We're about 130 staff. We rely quite heavily on pro bono legal work. We intervene That's a legal term in High Court and Federal Court cases with pro bono work from the legal profession. And we, of course, have been using the medical profession for this work, but we'll also be using them. We're about to do another inquiry, not a formal legal inquiry, but a research inquiry into domestic violence and the deaths of women and the impact, again, on children in domestic violence circumstances. But where to from here? We really are waiting now to see what happens in the May budget, frankly, because they may use it as a vehicle and camouflage for reducing our capacity. And that's going to be very, very difficult for us to deal with. And I have to accept the responsibility for that because, I could have done something nice and easy and not have gone near this. But then we wouldn't have been worth our name as a human rights body. We would have we would have commanded little respect, and we wouldn't have done our job. So we've walked into this, not totally blind, but certainly hoping that we don't get targeted. And we'll just we'll wait and see.
Well, with that, let's just join in with a round of applause.
Thank you very much.